CTTB.
Well, it's not the same without hearing the theme music come in the background.
Different.
That's already happening, of course. The magic of technology is already doing that. But,
it's already.
Hello,
doing
people.
That. Hello, everyone.
World. Hello, people that still haven't unsubscribed to the podcast. Although, frankly, if they stuck through with us through last year, then a mere kind of 3 months between a podcast is nothing.
Well, we got rather distracted, didn't we, when we were suddenly allowed out of our houses? And
this is true, yes. It was all going so well when we were locked down first time round.
Yeah, through the first lockdown. Yeah, we were pretty regular. Then, as soon as we were allowed out of the houses, it just all fell apart. I mean, there were a couple of opportunities. We decided to do something else.
This is true, actually. Yes.
Yeah.
Anyway, this podcast is only, I think, 10 weeks later than it was meant to be, so it's not that bad.
Life gets in the way, and then you find that you're locked in again, and you've got nothing to do. So there we are.
Indeed. So we have 6 albums as per usual, and those are Taylor Swift Taylor Swift Folklore. That's a good start. James Dean. God, I'm going to start again. I'm thinking, literally, I've forgotten how to do this. Taylor Swift Folklore. James Dean Bradfield, Even in Exile. Fountains DC, A Hero's Death. Seagulls, Open Up Your Head. Crown Lands, and Bruce Hornsby, No Secure Connection, which might be a warning for internet connections all over the place. Anyway, we'll see how far we get. So we start, of course, with what I believe is the 8th studio album from Miss Swift. What did you think, Peter?
Yeah. So he said, it's a bit of beer, getting his notes in front of him. I like this. I like this a lot. I think, I really like this album. It's, in many ways, I was reminded of the earlier part of her career. Obviously, before she went huge, she always was and still is such a great singer-songwriter. And back in the day, and no doubt we can bore everyone for the umpteenth time about our anecdote about seeing Taylor Swift in a moment. But it was always very more of a folksy Americana sort of driven sound anyway. So actually, This album is kind of really sort of scraping back all the pop of the last few years, particularly, the sort of overproduced. And I mean that I don't mean that in a derogatory way at all. The overproduced albums that she's been more famous for in recent times. And I'm thinking the last album, back to the last album in particular. And here we have something that's a bit more stripped back, as the title suggests. It does go back to that sort of folksy era of her music, but updated, of course, because there's no escaping. She is a massive star. And I think in terms of the production, I think this is a really strong album. I really liked it. More so than I thought I was going to. But I think I say that every time I listen to a Taylor Swift album. I think, I'm not going to like this. Taylor Swift, isn't it? And actually, I always enjoy it. So there you go. Whether she's doing the pop princess stuff or whether she's doing this, she's a outstanding, talented musician. And I've been quite effusive already. First album, and I'm just great. Great.
It's quite fun. It's quite funny. I mean, obviously, when it first came out, which was probably about 12, 13 weeks ago now, there were some people calling it her indie album, which I thought was very funny because I thought clearly by people who don't understand music or indie or anything. But clearly that was just because simply because she'd worked on the album with Aaron Dessner, who's a member of the band The National. So it's like, she's worked with a guy who's in a band who are kind of indie, so therefore this must be her indie album. You're thinking, no, not really. As you said, the clue's in the name.
Yeah. And Bon Iver on here as well, which just adds a little bit of extra cred, I think.
Bon Iver is on here, indeed.
Notes.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, I think it is a much more relaxed and stripped back version of Taylor Swift than we've had in a while. I think particularly strong on the opening 5 or 6 tracks, I think, are really, really good. I really love the one which opens the album, and then also Last Great American Dynasty, which I think is the finest pop moment on the album. And also like lyrics in that song as well, inspired by socialite and composer Rebecca Harkless, whose house Swift bought, and she quickly found parallels, obviously, between her own life and Harkness's as somebody that was very talked about and the kind of person that people kind of deemed to be scandalous if she did anything that was what we would classify as being a normal person. I will say, though, I found it a bit long.
No, okay.
I did find the middle of the album, for me, was a bit kind of,
Yeah, okay.
And wasn't grabbing me and saying, look at me, quite as much as the rest of the album. But it was only a kind of brief lull, because from about, I think, the song Mad Woman back onwards, which I think is about track 12, from there on towards the end, it kind of brought me back in. Particularly liked the song Betty as well, which was part of a 3-song story on the album, following on from Cardigan and August earlier on in the record. But yeah, I agree overall with that. I think, generally speaking, it's a pretty good record.
Yeah, I actually didn't find it that long. Maybe I just really clicked with me.
It's taking you 3 months to listen to it, Pete.
Yeah. I mean,
that's how long it is.
I won't lie to you. I perhaps haven't been listening to it for the entirety of the 3 months. It might be I did some work and then there was a long gap, and then I maybe did some more.
Indeed. Moving on to lead singer, guitarist of Manic Street Preachers, James Dean Bradfield, his second solo album, Even in Exile. And this is a concept album based on the life and death of Chilean activist, singer, poet, and Che Guevara lover Victor Jara, I think is how it's pronounced, who was tortured and killed during the dictatorship of Pinochet. So even just saying that, it frankly goes without saying that this is quite a self-indulgence worthy record. But, you know, Simple Minds have written about this guy before. U2 have written about him before. So he's quite a well-known person in the music business for people that want to wave flags. Interestingly, the album's lyrics are written by Welsh poet and playwright Patrick Jones, who also just happens to be the older brother of a certain Mr. Nicky Wire, which I found quite interesting. So, straight off, this is exactly the kind of album that I would expect James Dean Bradfield to make, just purely on the topic and description. And when it kicks off, the mixed language intro, I was already groaning, to be honest. But then the main music of the opening track, Raquevera, kicks in, and, you know, things start to look up a bit, especially towards the end of the track, where I really, really love the kind of repeated guitar riff solo towards the end of that opening track. And then things stay good for the next track, and it was probably the most kind of Manic-esque album track, The Boy from the Plantation. And from then on, I was just about sold on it, really. It mixes rock, a bit of prog, a bit of spaghetti western soundtrack type of thing nicely. Especially like the several kind of Rush influences present on the last song, and also more predominantly on the album's best track, in my opinion, which is the instrumental Seeking the Room with the Three Windows. And actually, there's another instrumental piece, an acoustic one under the mimosa tree, later on in the album as well, which is also really good, which has a nice touch of harmonica, film soundtrack vibe to it as well. So yeah, shaky start, but I must admit that I got much more enjoyment out of this record than I first thought I would, and all in all, it's actually a pretty decent record.
Yeah, I kind of went through a reverse experience in the beginning, and I agree with your appraisal of the context of the album, where it's come from, and obviously the motivation and so on. Obviously, I think it goes without saying that you wouldn't expect anything less.
Yes,
of James Dean Bradfield at this point. And to that point, I think certainly, I agree with you, actually, certainly early on, it does feel very Mannix, particularly at the beginning. And that's probably why I actually found the beginning, I actually enjoyed the beginning more, I think, than you did by the sounds of it. It was going along quite solidly for, 3 or 4 tracks. And then I sort of lost momentum for me, alas. But without, denigrating the album, I think it's very thought-provoking lyrically. It tells a story, and it tells it well, even if I think musically, for me at least, it was a little bit saggy in places. But actually, I did come around to, liking some of the later tracks as well. And blimey, it reminds me, I haven't actually listed any of the songs I like yet, which is usually my thing. But yeah, it goes without saying, The Boy from the Plantation, I actually quite liked. There'll Come a War, I actually also very much liked.
There you go.
There you go.
So, 2 down, 4 more to go. Next up is Fountains DC, A Hero's Death. And we obviously reviewed their debut album, Dog Rule. Was it the start of last year? It might be the start of last year. Which we both like quite a lot. So, second time around, how are you feeling?
It's a solid album. It's quite... and I'm trying to sort of recall, I was probably more positive about the first album. It's quite a lo-fi, downbeat sort of album, but there's enough going on to keep you interested in terms of, once again, you've got the punk, the garage rock, the spoken word here and there as well, which is great. I preferred second half of this album to the first half. I particularly like the tracks A Lucid Dream and the title track A Hero's Death, which is more the spoken word sort of track, or the shouted word sort of. Mm-hmm. Again, I think this is a band that probably do sound absolutely fantastic live. Not that any of us remember what live music sounds like at this stage. It's I can really imagine sort of being in the pit of some place somewhere, really enjoying this as a live experience. I think you always lose some of that, I think, when you record it. But yeah, no, I really, I said solid right at the start. I actually really like this album too, even if it is downbeat. I think it's strong second album. I was possibly more positive about the debut, the first album.
I think we both were actually.
This feels like a bit more tempered, a bit.
Well, I'm remembering.
Yeah, it's As I said,
and when I'm remembering the first album, there was an element of some same old tricks for me. So, the endless repeated lines and repeated musical riffs.
Yeah.
Which I have to confess grated on me a bit more with this record than on their first outing. Because it felt a tad more lazy this time around. Although I do say that in a month where a new AC/DC album has come out. And to be fair, that album is far from lazy, but, I can't deny that they are using some of the same old musical tricks on it that they've been using for the last half century. So yeah, I mean, I really like the opening track. Dip Long gets off to a really good start. Then I'm similar to you in a way. I think my favorite section of the album is the kind of 4-track run from A Lucid Dream, Search Lucid Dream, You Said, A Hero's Death, which, having just said, I have a problem with repeating the same line over and over again. That's probably the most repeated same line over and over again track on the album. Also sounded a bit like The Strokes, I thought, that track. And Living in America, which is one of the few tracks of the album that's very, very different sounding to a lot of the others. So yeah, I like you. I think it's still a really good record, but doesn't quite manage to scale the heights of the debut album for me. But still one of the better recent indie bands to come around.
Yeah, that's fair.
Moving on to, speaking of indie, although slightly more on the indie pop side of things now, we have the debut album by a band called Sea Girls. First off, great name. Love the obvious avian pronunciation fun there. It's called Open Your Head. I'm going to say, this is a pretty decent indie pop record. I say that whilst also saying that it never sounds especially original or unique. But it does deliver a pleasing collection of essentially 3.5-minute indie pop tunes. It kicks off well with Transplant, which is very much in the kind of Frank Turner Killers-esque sounding space. And indeed, you could argue that the Turner Killers bit continues throughout a good chunk of the rest of the album too, really. And speaking of two, but even a bit of U2, in fact, if you want to stretch it a bit. But since these acts have also written the odd catchy pop tune in their time, it's probably not all bad. The album suffers a bit for me on the negative side of the fact that the singer, whose name I've written down somewhere, singer Henry Chamomile, does have one of those voices which does sound like quite a few other recent indie pop band singers to me. So it means you are quite likely to, if you hear it on the radio, think you could be listening to Bastille or one of many other similar bands besides, although I doubt that's going to harm them commercially. So it bounces along quite nicely in a foot-tapping indie pop anthems kind of way. Definitely a kind of band that I'm sure serious quote-unquote indie bands probably hate. But also balanced with some quite fun lyrics as well. On the mental health side of things, the song Do You Really Want to Know, which great pop song, by the way, has a good line. It's I've been overthinking all my life. They'll ask me up in heaven why I fell on my knife. All my emotions, they're technically right, but I don't want to go there and fuck up your night, which I quite liked. Yeah, simple, fun indie pop record.
I agree. I think it's another great indie album. And we've had, I was thinking it was Sports Team, wasn't it? Podcast.
Yes, early in the year, yes.
Yeah, and I think what your point there about it's sort of similar in terms of vocal yet different. I liked the sort of the more of a leaning into a sort of 90s indie album really than perhaps we've had more recently. I really liked the track All I Want to Hear You Say. It kind of almost had a Jarvis Cocker pulp style storytelling element to it, which again reminded me of some of those great albums of that sort of mid to late 90s era. And it's funny when you say the popability of Do You Really Want to Know? The riff, I don't know if you notice, it's like Whitney Houston's How Do They Know? How do they know?
Yes, indeed.
And that was the guitar. So I was like, what is that tune? And it bugged me for days. And then I listened to it again. I was like, it's Whitney Houston.
That's also a great song, so that's fine.
Exactly. So I was like, this is great. This is a great. It's not only an indie album. It's got that sort of popability sense to it as well. So I enjoyed that. For me, again, perhaps a little, as for you with one of the previous albums, perhaps a little on the longer side, but actually not by much. and some great some great lyrical stories as well, some of which you touched on already. So yeah, no, I thought a solid indie record. I think we've actually done quite well this year in some of the indie albums that we're getting. It seems that that sort of dearth or drought of indie albums that we complained about probably a couple of years ago, it seems to be turning a corner. We've got some great bands coming through. So it's a shame we can't.
It does seem to be true. Well, yes.
Yeah, no, I really like it. It's going to be a tough call on this podcast actually, because I really like that one as well.
4 down, 2 to go. Next up, I think this is a debut album as well, although I think they might have had an EP out before. This is Crown Lands from Canada, and their album called, well, Crown Lands.
Yeah, imagine if it was titled. Yeah, here we go. I kept waiting for this one to click with me, but it never quite did. Again, I think I keep trotting this phrase out in this particular podcast. Second half, definitely better. We get that printed on the merch when we get around to that. And it seems...
See, I think I probably like the first half of this one better.
Did you? See, I can see why. I think the first half was much more planted in some of that sort of... how to describe it? The sort of late 80s rock influence going on there. I could hear it. Whereas I think I found the sound perhaps settled down more into their own sound as the album went on. That is until the last track, which went all crazy psychedelia on me, which I wasn't expecting at all.
Sundance, yes.
Yeah, Sundance. So that was a bit of a whoa moment for me. I particularly liked, having said that, I particularly liked Howling Back. I thought that was a great track. And End of the Road as well, which I think was later in the album, in that second half. But as I say, I never quite got there with this one, I have to be honest. So what did you think?
Liked it more than you do, but I've changed my mind on it quite a few times in the last couple of months. I mean, it's very much if you ever wondered what the White Stripes would sound like if they had more kind of Led Zeppelin, early Sabbath kind of leanings, then Crown Lands pretty much might be the answer. Because vocally, Cody Bowles certainly seems to be able to channel both early Robert Plant and Ozzy Osbourne at different parts of this record, and even a touch of Geddy Lee and Rush. Yes, the second mention of Rush in this podcast. Canada's finest, thrown in for good measure on Forest Song. I have to confess, I've played the lead track quite a few times, and it's probably the most White Stripesy song on the album, actually. Having mentioned them, and then it kind of goes into a bit more of what they're trying to do themselves, I suppose, after that. And River I really like as well. It comes straight after it, which I've put on a couple of playlists. Leadfoot is actually one of my favourite tracks on the album, partly because it has sections in it that reminded me of Shawaddy Waddy and Mud. Although I suspect they were probably going for more of a T-Rex vibe, but, can't have everything. End of the Road that you mentioned, lyrically I quite like that, since it seems to be dealing with Indigenous communities in Canada and their kind of persecution. Fancy that. Indigenous communities being persecuted in the country. Who'd have thought it? So that was quite interesting from a kind of lyrical perspective. But yeah, it's my turn to say solid, really. It's a solid record. Quite enjoyed it. Interesting enough to make me check out any future releases, but by the same token, fine.
Cool. Not for me, alas. So sounds like you enjoyed it far better.
We still have a secure connection, so we will finish off with Bruce Hornsby, no non-secure connection. Fifth solo album from Bruce Hornsby. Obviously, he's produced more albums than that, but this is a solo album in the sense that he's not with the Range or the Noisemakers or as part of other bands such as the Grateful Dead and various others who he's released records with. And as this kicks off, you can immediately tell that Justin Vernon, yes, here he is popping up at both ends of the podcast, is also present here on Cleopatra Drones, which has a kind of Peter Gabriel vibe to it as well. It's a really great way to kick off the album. Although it is an album that I think definitely needs a few listens before you have any hope in hell of getting to grips with it. Very experimental in nature, and by far the most experimental thing on the list this month, certainly as far as the construction of the songs go. And in fact, he's referenced that doing film score work for Spike Lee has kind of influenced the way this album kind of moved along. So I would not describe it as an easy listening experience, which is not to say that it doesn't have immediacy in places, Cleopatra Drones being a fairly prime example, but also there's a couple of out-and-out, I suppose, traditional pop songs on the album. The final track on the album, No Limits, and also the song that was released as a single off the album, which is his duet with James Mercer of the Shins, My Resolve, which is a conventional pop track, but it's the only conventional pop track on the record. There are bits and pieces of the album that I like. So there's a funky track which is called Bright Star Cast, which has Jamelia Woods singing and some really good guitar playing from Vernon Reid of Living Colour, which is quite interesting. It's also one of the other songs on it that's a bit more conventional is the duet with Leon Russell, Anything Can Happen, which again sounds like it should be on a totally different album than this, although given that apparently they recorded the demo 25 years ago, it clearly was meant to be on a different album than this. I think my general feeling of this record is that it is great to see any artist, I mean, I've said this before, experimenting and challenging themselves and indeed the listener. And you certainly couldn't accuse Hornsby of not doing so here. And I think there's a lot to admire in the construction and in the production and the general kind of vibe of the record. But in its delivery, the album just kind of misses the mark too much for me. And it felt like I was having to put a lot of effort in for not getting as much out.
Yeah, I concur. It was a bit of a slog, this one. Although amusingly, I've written at the top of my notes here, it's a bit old jazz, this. Very Scott. But I thought you might have appreciated it better. Again, I think second half worked better for me. I think I've said that now 3 times. It is a bit of a slog, though. And you know what? It's almost that last track almost stands out like a sore thumb because it really is the pop track, the mainstream track. And you kind of almost wish, oh, I'll tack that on the end there. I was just getting into this. I've worked so hard as well. Again, it's not certainly not without merit. If you're prepared to give it a go, I quite like the track My Resolve, and Bright Star Cast. Probably the two that sort of stood out for me in terms of likability from a Pete point of view. I also found the track Porn Hour quite amusing. In the sort of jolly juxtaposition between the tune, the music, and the lyrics. I was like, ooh, biting social commentary there. So I've written that down as well, but it's something that I like. But to be honest with you, the rest of it was pretty tough going for me. So a bit of a miss, I'm afraid. Yeah.
Okay
We have
then.
buzzers.
The big question then.
Oh yeah.
Album of the podcast.
Tricky.
So it's clearly not Crown Lands, and it's clearly not Bruce Hornsby.
Is it? And to be honest with you, I haven't. We had a couple of good podcasts prior to this, I think, where it was really obvious. This one's a bit.
Yes.
It's not James Dean Bradfield either, I'm afraid. Just far too pretentious. I'm sorry. Very worthy, I'm sure. And the fans of many a year will like it, but not for me. I'm going to say Taylor Swift. It's either that or Seagulls, but probably leaning more towards Taylor Swift. There you go. Who'd thunk that?
I would probably say the same, as in choice-wise. Would I choose Taylor Swift as well? If I shouted downstairs and asked my opinion of my daughter, I'm sure I would be instructed that the correct answer is Taylor Swift.
Yeah.
So I'll just go with that because it makes life much easier in my household.
Yeah, which reminds me.
Yeah, Taylor Swift.
Taylor Swift, great. Which reminds me, we've not trotted through our Taylor Swift story for the umpteenth time, but maybe we'll save that for another time.
Maybe next time.
Yeah, I'm sure the listeners are fully aware, all three of them.
Indeed. So until next time, hopefully we'll get one of these in before Christmas. Yeah, until then.
Till then.
Bye.